He walked into the hotel lobby, no name tag, no entourage, just a man in a clean suit. The staff looked him over and told him to wait outside. What they didn't know was that just hours later, their entire company would be left hollow, not because of rage, but because of the man they refused to see. Some stories aren't told in anger. They unfold in silence, measured intentional, undeniable. This isn't about revenge, it's about presence. About the quiet strength of a man who didn't raise his voice, because his walk spoke louder than their judgment. This is the story of Elijah Monroe, a man who didn't ask for respect. He built it. And when they told him to step outside, he stepped forward and took the future with him. 7:30 a.m. The San Francisco sky was still cool with a faint fog clinging to the skyline. Morning light spilled gently across the towering glass buildings. A charcoal-colored electric sedan pulled up in front of the Wyndham Veritas Hotel, host of one of the quarter's most important tech summits. The door opened, and Elijah Monroe stepped out. A crisp white shirt, tailored gray suit, polished black shoes. No name badge, no assistant, no photographers waiting. Just a man walking with quiet precision, the kind that made people turn and look, though they didn't know why. Elijah was the founder of NovaCrest, a biotech company on the verge of a groundbreaking deal with Viersen Group, but he hadn't arrived early to run through a keynote or mic check. He came to observe, to see with complete honesty whether the people calling him strategic partner behind boardroom doors had the decency to recognize value when it came in quietly. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about truth. And truth always reveals itself in the silence before the applause. Elijah hadn't spoken a word before the valet. A young man with hurried eyes gave him a quick up and down. No designer logos, no flashy watch, no entourage. Just another someone. The boy didn't ask his name, didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he glanced toward the BMW pulling in behind Elijah and barked to his coworker, "Take this one first." Then to Elijah, without eye contact, deliveries go around back. Elijah's eyebrows rose ever so slightly, not in surprise, but in wary recognition. He'd heard those words before, in airports, in courtrooms, even in places built by people who looked like him. But he didn't react. He turned quietly, returned to his car, and parked it himself in the public garage a block away. Every step back toward that hotel was light, but something heavy had shifted inside him. Not anger, not pride, something colder, sharper, and with a perfect memory. Inside the hotel, amber light spilled from crystal chandeliers onto polished granite floors. Elijah stepped in a whisper of morning wind, still clinging to his coat collar. At the reception desk, a middle-aged woman typed briskly into her screen, never lifting her head. Elijah stopped in front of her, calm but clear. "Good morning, I'm here for the Viersen Summit." NovaCrest reserved the Emerald Hall and the entire 16th floor. She glanced up briefly. Her eyes hesitated for half a beat, then darted back down. "You with AV setup?" "No," Elijah replied. "I'm the founder and CEO of NovaCrest." Another pause. Then she spoke with mechanical politeness. "The space isn't ready yet. You'll need to wait outside." No apology, no eye contact. Just protocol, wrapped in cold distance. Elijah tilted his head slightly. "I'm not a guest. I'm not a technician. I'm the reason these doors opened this morning." Her silence said it all. Elijah stepped out of the lobby a second time. Not rushed, not rejected, just unbothered. But he knew in dismissing him, they hadn't denied a man. They had disqualified themselves from the room he once offered. Outside, the sun had risen higher, scattering golden light across the pavement. Elijah stood still, took a slow breath, then pulled out his phone. "Mila," he said, his voice low, steady, "move the entire event to Penrose Hotel. Activate our backup plan. Cancel all bookings here. If there are penalties, send them to me." There was a pause. Mila, his assistant, didn't ask what happened. She'd worked with Elijah long enough to know when he spoke like this, there was nothing left to discuss. "Elijah, do you want me to come?" she asked gently. "No, stick to schedule. But from now on, we only host in places that know how to open more than just doors." He hung up and walked back in one last time. Not to fight, but to close the chapter himself. For the third time that morning, Elijah stepped across the lobby floor, but this time his footsteps rang differently. With each step, he wasn't just walking, he was drawing a line. He stopped at the front desk. Gail, the receptionist, looked up with a flicker of confusion. Elijah set a sleek business card on the marble counter. "My name is Elijah Monroe," he said, voice even unshaken. "I'm the person who booked today's entire summit. 72 rooms, 2 conference halls, 4 investor luncheons, and every guest your staff just proudly welcomed because of me." Gail froze. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unable to move. "I'm not angry," Elijah continued. "In fact, I'm grateful. Because now I know without doubt that this venue doesn't deserve what we bring." At that moment, a manager rushed in, short of breath. "Sir, we sincerely—" "It's too late," Elijah interrupted softly but firmly. Sincerity should have shown up at first sight. And with that, he turned around. No drama, no raised voice, just a man who refused to be invisible, and walked out without needing to look back. As Elijah stepped out into the morning light, the world around him carried on: valets opening doors, hotel staff arranging flowers, polite laughter floating from the lobby cafe. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But inside Elijah, something precise and unshakable had been set in motion. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to prove anything. He made one call, gave one instruction, and the ripple it would cause would outlast every apology never spoken. Within minutes, Mila confirmed guests were being redirected. The AV team was mobilizing. The caterers rerouted. Elijah simply nodded. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a steady pulse in his chest that said, this is what integrity looks like in motion. Because respect is never requested, it's expected. And when it's absent, the door doesn't slam. It closes gently, so no one hears it until it's too late. Back at the Wyndham, the staff still didn't understand. They poured coffee into porcelain cups, prepped the untouched buffet, and adjusted place cards. Someone asked, "Where are the guests?" but no one could answer. Then the front desk phone rang. "This is to confirm the full cancellation of Nova Crest's booking," said a calm voice on the line, "including 72 rooms, 2 halls, all services. Any cancellation fees may be forwarded to Mr. Monroe." The manager's face went pale. Gail felt her pulse quicken. She opened the reservation email again. There it was: Elijah Monroe, top of the list, in bold, the name she hadn't bothered to read. And in that moment, she realized they hadn't turned away a man. They had walked an entire future out the door, and hadn't even held it open. Across town, the Penrose Hotel was already buzzing. Staff stood ready at the entrance, holding warm smiles and freshly printed guest lists. No one asked Elijah for ID. No one looked him up and down. They simply said, "We've been expecting you, sir. This way, please." Inside the Emerald Room was reimagined: soft gold lighting, fresh orchids, rows of chairs arranged in a perfect crescent, coffee steamed beside delicate pastries. Each table had a handwritten welcome card. Elijah didn't step onto the stage. Not yet. He slipped into the speaker lounge where Mila stood reviewing the deck. She looked up. "Elijah," she asked softly. "We start in 10, he said. "No changes. Do you want to address what happened earlier?" He shook his head. "No, why not? Because some stories are better understood in contrast. Let them feel the difference without me ever needing to explain it." 10 minutes later, Elijah walked onto the stage. No music, no introduction. Just him and the kind of quiet that draws a room to stillness. "Thank you for being here," he began, voice steady. "I know there was a change in venue this morning. A few murmurs, some polite nods. I won't explain why, because sometimes the why is already in the room with us." He paused, scanning the crowd. "There are places where you rent space, and there are places where your presence is invited. We chose to gather here not because of inconvenience, but because of alignment." The silence grew deeper. He let it hold. "I don't want admiration, I want awareness. I don't need applause. I need clarity. Novacrest doesn't just build innovation, we build culture. And that begins by walking into rooms that don't question whether we belong in them." Applause followed, not loud, but honest, the kind that doesn't fade when the lights go down. After his speech, Elijah returned to his seat as the room filled with quiet energy. No one spoke of the old hotel. No one needed to. The contrast had done its work. Across the city, the Wyndham stood like a hollow frame, tables, untouched signs being pulled down, flowers slowly wilting. Gail sat at her desk, typing her incident report. No one yelled at her. No one accused her. But she knew deeply irrevocably she had misjudged a man who didn't need to say a word to reveal who he truly was. And Elijah, he didn't post on social media, didn't speak to the press. He didn't need a spotlight to show what had happened. But word travels differently when it's true. One company executive whispered to another. He moved the whole summit without raising his voice. And just like that, a ripple became a shift. Not in volume, not in headlines, but in perspective. Because real change doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly. And when it leaves, it takes the future with it. While Elijah continued his meetings at the Penrose, where every eye now met his with newfound respect across the city, the Wyndham had grown eerily quiet. The buffet stood untouched. The coffee had cooled. Staff exchanged glances that no longer carried certainty, but doubt. Gail sat at the front desk, trembling fingers hovering over her keyboard. She pulled up the reservation list. There it was again, Elijah Monroe, top of the list, confirmed, highlighted. And yet, she hadn't looked, hadn't cared. She could still see his eyes from that morning, not angry, not sharp, just still, like a mirror she hadn't wanted to face. No one had scolded her. No official reprimand had come. But she knew. A door hadn't just been closed. A standard had been silently raised, and she'd been left standing on the wrong side of it. In the days that followed, the city moved as usual, traffic flowing, lunches ordered, elevators humming. But in corner offices and quiet hallways, the name Elijah Monroe was whispered. Not loudly, but with weight. Emails circulated between companies. Novacrest switched venues last-minute internal reasons. But those who knew, knew. Word spread through Slack messages and coffee chats. He walked out, pulled everything, no fuss. A tech exec tweeted, "Prejudice always has a price." Today, someone finally handed them the bill quietly. And just like that, Elijah's choice echoed in places he'd never stepped into. It wasn't scandal, it was revelation. Some started asking themselves, would we have seen him? That's how legacy moves, not as headlines, but as a shift in how people hold themselves the next time they meet someone who doesn't look the part but is the reason the room exists. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his office, a warm glow from the desk lamp spilling across a worn leather notebook he had kept since Novacrest's early days. No media, no interviews, no drafted statements, just a pen in hand. He scribbled softly. Sometimes people don't need a lesson. They just need a mirror large enough to see who they've become. He didn't act out of offense. He wasn't trying to prove he'd been wronged. What moved him that morning was something deeper, a responsibility. Not to himself, but to those coming next. To the young black men who would walk into lobbies. To the daughters of this generation who would lead companies and be told to wait outside. If he said nothing, it would signal agreement. And Elijah Monroe had never been one to stay silent in the face of a system pretending it had changed while still holding the same clipboard at the front desk. The next morning, a senior manager at the Wyndham finally called Novacrest. The receptionist transferred him. His voice was measured. "I'm calling to extend our sincerest apologies to Mr. Monroe. We'd like to offer complimentary services. Waive cancellation." Mila, calm and crisp, replied, "Mr. Monroe is no longer accepting apologies on this matter." A pause. "We'd like to—" "It's not about refunds. It's about respect," Mila said softly but firmly. "And you missed the moment when it mattered most." Click. The line went dead, but the message lingered. In Novacrest's office, Elijah looked out the window as sunlight poured across the skyline. He took a slow sip of his coffee. No anger, no victory, just peace, because this time he had chosen not to remain quiet, and he had let the silence speak for itself. At a Friday team gathering, one of Novacrest's youngest interns, Jordan, stood to speak. His voice trembled, but his eyes were clear. "I heard about what happened at the hotel," he said. "I just want to say thank you for showing us that real strength doesn't have to raise its voice." The room was silent. Elijah looked up from his seat. Jordan continued, "If it had been me, I might have reacted, gotten angry, demanded to be seen. But watching how you handled it, I learned something I didn't even know I needed to understand sometimes. Silence has more weight than any fight." Elijah Rose walked to Jordan and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll see unfairness out there," he said. "But don't let it change who you are. Let it shape how you walk with your head high and heart clean." The team applauded, not because they had witnessed a victory, but because they had seen a man who'd shown them how to hold dignity, not just in the face of disrespect, but in the space after it. In the days that followed, San Francisco returned to its rhythm. The traffic buzzed, meetings resumed, baristas scribbled names on coffee cups. But in glass-walled offices, high above the sidewalks, something lingered, an echo that refused to fade. Elijah Monroe's name wasn't on billboards, but people whispered. A senior exec turned to his assistant and said, "Imagine if that had been our partner." At lunch tables across the city, young professionals lowered their voices. He moved everything quietly, no drama. But everyone felt it. The media never picked it up. And that was exactly what made it louder. Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones that trend. They're the ones that shift how a city looks at itself in the morning. Not with guilt, but with a kind of quiet responsibility. That evening, Elijah stayed late. The office was quiet, lights dimmed, except for the glow from his glass-walled workspace. As he stepped into the hallway, he crossed paths with Cynthia, a team lead who had once worked reception. She paused, then walked up to him. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, her voice low. Elijah turned, for what Cynthia looked down. "Because I used to be Gail. I've looked at people and made assumptions based on how they looked, how they dressed. I didn't even know I was doing it." Elijah didn't judge. He simply nodded. "We've all been Gail," he said. "The question is, are we brave enough to stop being her?" The elevator doors closed behind them. But in Cynthia, something had opened. Not guilt, awareness. And once awareness awakens, the walls that once stood firm begin to shift. The next morning, an unmarked envelope sat on Elijah's desk. No name on the outside. Inside was a handwritten note: "I didn't know who you were. And that says more about me than it ever did about you." Signed simply, G. Elijah read it, then folded it shut. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply exhaled a long, quiet breath, because he hadn't needed an apology. He had only needed confirmation that his silence had reached something human. What he defended that day wasn't reputation. It was his identity, not the kind printed on business cards, but the kind carried in posture, in choice, in the refusal to stoop just to be seen. This was his victory, one no article would capture, but one that would live quietly in the space between self-respect and the urge to shout. Weeks later, Nova Crest hosted a mentorship event for interns. Elijah didn't speak. He sat in the back, listening to the voices of youth, uncertain, hopeful, real. One young woman raised her hand. "Mr. Monroe, when they didn't recognize you that day, did it feel like you were erased?" Elijah paused. "No one can erase you," he said, "unless you agree to disappear." The room went still. A title can be taken. A platform can be denied. But how you carry yourself, that's your map. And someday someone will follow that map because you walked it first. In the front row, a girl blinked fast to hold back tears. Not because she was moved, but because for the first time someone told her she didn't need to prove her worth. She just needed to protect it. That evening, Elijah stood alone on the rooftop terrace of Nova Crest. The city glowed beneath him, a patchwork of light and possibility. The sky faded from gold to violet, and the air turned crisp. He closed his eyes. No cameras, no applause, just the hush of a chapter closing. And the knowing that somewhere another Gail was watching herself more closely. Somewhere another Jordan was walking a little taller. Somewhere a hotel manager would think twice before deciding who mattered. He hadn't needed headlines. He had created horizon lines. Because maybe his daughter one day would walk into a hotel lobby and be asked, "Are you checking in?" Or "Are you the keynote today?" And when that day comes, no one will remember Elijah's silence, but they will live in its impact. Because the loudest changes don't come from a raised voice. They come from a man who walks out and never needs to return. A week later, Elijah was invited to speak at a private forum for startup founders. He politely declined, not because he didn't have time, but because he no longer needed a stage to repeat what the city already understood, even if no one had said it aloud. Instead, he sat in a quiet conference room at Nova Crest with a group of university students. One of them asked, "Have you ever felt tired of proving yourself just because of your skin color?" Elijah looked out the window where the trees were beginning to shed their leaves. Then he answered, "I don't prove myself anymore. I just walk forward. If people walk with me, good. If they stay behind, let them stay with their assumptions." The room held stillness like a held breath. And that's when they realized true power doesn't live in volume. It lives in the quiet clarity of what you leave behind and what you refuse to carry forward. At the Wyndham, no emergency meetings were called. No press memos were circulated. But the shift was unmistakable. Receptionists no longer rushed their glances. Valets paused just a moment longer. The word "sir" now came with softer eyes, not forced courtesy. Gail still worked the front desk. She hadn't been fired, but she had volunteered for the night shift and stopped laughing at jokes that used to make her smirk. One night, a middle-aged black man walked in wearing a simple brown coat. Gail stood and walked to greet him personally. No one had told her to do that, but Elijah Monroe's silence had become a mirror too large to ignore. It didn't scold. It reflected. And once you've seen who you were in a moment of quiet shame, you can't unsee it. Sometimes a structure doesn't collapse from thunder. It begins to shift from within when someone finally listens to the silence between their own words. Mila walked into Elijah's office holding a thick folder. "Orion Group just accepted all our original terms," she said. "They've requested that you personally lead the site visit." Elijah flipped through the pages, nodding slowly until he saw the address. "It's at Wyndham," Mila paused. "Want me to decline?" Elijah closed the folder. "No, we don't run from places. We just don't live by them." 3 days later, he walked through the same front doors that had once turned him away. There was no tension in his steps, no trace of the wound, only presence steady, certain. The same people were there, but this time the room leaned toward him, not because they recognized his name, but because he no longer needed them to. The tour at Orion Group was smooth, professional, respectful. Elijah said nothing about the past, no subtle jabs, no reminder of what had happened. But in the way he moved, the way people responded, there was something different. A senior partner leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "He doesn't speak much, but I want to be someone he'd choose to work with." That's what real transformation looks like. Not dominance, but invitation. Not fear, but elevation. Elijah didn't want fanfare. He wanted a world where his daughter someday could walk into a lobby without being mistaken for the help. Where someone might greet her and say, "Are you here to check in, or are you leading today's keynote?" And when that happens, no one will remember Elijah Monroe by name, but they will live inside the door he once refused to be locked out of. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Elijah took his daughter to the park. Her yellow dress danced in the wind as she skipped across sidewalk chalk drawings. Her laughter floated up into the trees like sunlight. Elijah sat on a bench, sipping warm coffee content. A young man approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, are you Elijah Monroe?" Elijah nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you for showing us how silence can echo louder than anything." Elijah smiled gently. "You don't need to be loud to be heard," he said. "You just need to live in a way worth listening to." The young man walked away quietly changed. Elijah turned back to his daughter, now climbing the jungle gym with fearless joy. He watched her, knowing that the doors she would one day walk through wouldn't open just because of her name. They'd open because her father once stood outside and chose not to knock, but to build a world where she wouldn't have to. Elijah Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't post about the injustice. He didn't demand recognition. He simply walked away with grace, clarity, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. And sometimes that's the greatest Powerball, because the most powerful protest isn't always loud. It's knowing when a room doesn't deserve you and choosing not to beg for a seat. This story isn't just about one man being disrespected. It's about every person who's ever been looked past, dismissed, underestimated. And it's a reminder you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to walk like you know who you are, even when they don't. Walk with dignity. Lead with quiet strength, and let the world adjust.